2, what is the fatality rate of COVID-19 and how does it compare to the flu? Chapter 13, death risk from COVID-19, overall, by age, and compared to the flu. Conclusions. Overall infection fatality rate, IFR for COVID, which is the percentage of people infected who die, was 0.46% in the spring wave of 2020. That should be viewed as an upper estimate. It may have been half that in the spring wave, and it is almost certainly at least a little less in the second wave occurring in the fall to the winter of 2020 to 2021. The IFR varies greatly by age. It is less than 0.01% for those under age 25, about 9% for age 85 and over. Overall, the IFR is about 3.5 times higher for COVID than ordinary influenza in recent years with widespread flu vaccine usage. The IFR of COVID is 1.7 times higher than the IFR of influenza in unvaccinated persons, that is, no vaccine against the flu. COVID is much less deadly than ordinary influenza for children under age 18. For the year 2020, COVID produced about 6 times more deaths than a typical flu year of recent years. 2020 was the deadliest year for influenza and pneumonia deaths since the 1918-19 Spanish flu, but had only about 2 times more than the typical number of flu deaths per million population of 1950 to 1970. The 1918 to 1919 flu produced about 3.5 times as many deaths relative to population as COVID, and killed the young at as high or a higher rate than it killed the old. So it produced at least 15 times the person years of life lost relative to population compared to COVID. COVID is much closer in its damage to ordinary influenza than to the 1918-19 flu. Your risk of death from COVID. You may want to know what your chances are of dying from COVID if you contract it. I do not think the government or media have done a very good job of answering that question, so I will try to answer it here. To answer that question, first we want to know the infection fatality rate, number of deaths divided by number of infected individuals in the population, number of infected people in the population. Here. To answer that question, first we want to know the infection fatality rate, number of deaths divided by number of infected persons. For that, we need to know, in addition to how many people have died of COVID, how many people have been infected. As elaborated in Chapter 3, based on the data of Anand et al., reference 1, 9.3% of the U.S. population of 328 million was infected as of early July 2020, which means 30,504,000 had been infected by July 1, 2020. The number of U.S. COVID deaths was 140,775 as of July 15th, 2020. Dividing the 140,775 deaths into the 30,504,000 infections gives an infection fatality rate, IFR, of 0.46% in the U.S. in the spring 2020 wave of COVID up to July 15th, 2020. But that is the overall rate. The actual risk of dying is much higher for the elderly and much lower for children. And it is higher for sick people and lower for healthy people. What you probably want to know is what your personal risk is, or the risk of your loved ones, given your age or their age. Based on the age distribution of COVID deaths reported by the CDC as of December 12, 2020, reference 2, and based on the percentage of persons of different ages infected reported by Anand et al., I calculate the following age-specific infection fatality rates for COVID, defined as the percentage of infected people who die. Appendix 1 shows how I calculated these numbers and the sources. It is interesting that even in the age 85 and over group, about 91% of the infected persons survive COVID. In fact, these numbers for the case fatality rate should be viewed as an upper estimate for the spring wave. Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford writes that the median case fatality rate from seroprevalence surveys around the world is 0.2%. Sood et al. Moreover, there is reason to believe the seroprevalence tests are underestimating the number of people who have been infected by missing people who have mild or asymptomatic disease because they produce low levels of IgG antibodies, the type being tested, and those levels may fade over time. Burgess et al. And Bajima et al. See Appendix 2. Also, the estimate of 0.46% is based on Anand's study of dialysis patients, and that is a sick group of people that you would expect would take more precautions than normal to try to prevent being infected. So it is a group I would expect to have lower seroprevalence than the population as a whole. So the true case fatality rate in the spring of 2020 may be half of the 0.46% that I have estimated. In that case, each of the age-specific fatality rates should be cut in half. And in the second wave of fall to the winter 2020 to 2021, it seems certain that the infection fatality rate is lower than it was in the spring wave. It is lower because one, we have new treatments and have learned which treatments work, and two, the virus has mutated to forms that are more contagious but less deadly. This is discussed in more detail in Chapter 3. Data discussed in Chapter 3 suggests at least a third fewer infected people are dying in the fall-winter 2020 to 2021 than in the initial spring wave of 2020. So in the fall and winter wave, I think it is likely that the infection fatality rate is about 0.30%, or 2/3 of the 0.46 I used for the spring wave, and your chance of dying in the fall-winter of 2020 to 2021 if you were infected was probably about 2/3 of the number in Table 1. The fourth column of the percentage of people in each age group who have died of COVID in 2020 up to about December 12th, according to the CDC. The third column, I think, is a useful way to think about your COVID risk. It is the ratio of your risk of dying from COVID if you are infected to your risk of dying from any cause this year or in 2019 before COVID hit. We all have an intuitive sense of how likely we are to die in the coming year, although I think we probably don't think about it much and probably underestimate the possibility. For those ages 65 and up, their risk of dying from COVID if they're infected is about 65% of what their risk of dying was this year if COVID had not happened. For persons under age 25, the risk of dying from COVID if they're infected is negligible, 5% or less of their risk of dying from all causes, and most people under age 25 do not spend a lot of time worrying about their risk of dying this year from any other cause. For adults ages 25 to 64, their risk of dying from COVID if they're infected is between 12 and 43% of their risk of dying from any cause. So if you're age 65 and older, you should be almost as worried about dying of COVID if you're infected as you were of dying this year before COVID hit. If you are less than 65, you should be less worried about dying from COVID, even if you're infected, than you were about dying in general this year before COVID hit. And if you're a child or adult under age 25, you really should not be worried about dying of COVID at all. Comparison to influenza. How do COVID deaths compare to flu deaths, and how does the infection fatality rate for COVID compare to the infection fatality rate of flu or influenza? I think the best way to answer that is just to look at raw deaths. In the US, we had 59,120 deaths in 2018 due to influenza or pneumonia, according to the CDC, reference 6, which in most years is about the 8th leading cause of death. That was a pretty normal year for the past decade. According to Worldometer, we had 362,664 COVID deaths in the US in 2020. So by that measure, it was about 6 times worse than a normal year for flu deaths. That 6x figure represents a combination both of how contagious it is and how lethal it is once a person is infected by the virus. COVID is, or was in the spring of 2020, 3.5x more lethal by IFR, or percentage of the infected people who die, as calculated above. And therefore, to achieve 6x higher deaths must be almost 2 times more contagious than influenza. That makes sense because other strains of coronavirus cause the common cold, and the common cold infects about 50% of the population each year, while influenza infects about 15% typically. The evidence suggests that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is almost 2 times more contagious than influenza, and about equally as or slightly less contagious than coronaviruses or other viruses that cause the common cold. Let's look just at lethality compared to influenza, how lethal the virus is among infected people. The most recent complete data from the CDC for influenza is, quote, estimated influenza illnesses, medical visits, hospitalizations, and deaths in the United States 2017 to 2018 influenza season, reference 7. It estimates 61,099 deaths and 44,802,629, very precise number, symptomatic illnesses. That is a 0.136% infection fatality rate. I have calculated the COVID infection fatality rate as 0.46% or 3.4-fold higher than influenza. The CDC report breaks down illnesses and deaths by age, allowing me to calculate the following numbers by age. In Table 2, I used Minnesota numbers to calculate the COVID IFR because Minnesota has finer age breakdowns that allow more precise comparison to the age breakdowns used for influenza. One interesting finding here is that COVID is much less deadly than influenza for children. Of course, influenza is not very deadly for children either, but COVID almost never causes death in children. The same result would be the case if I had used US numbers. Also interesting to find that among 18 to 49-year-olds, COVID and ordinary influenza are about equally deadly in terms of infection fatality rate. Overall, the COVID IFR is 3.38 times as high as the influenza IR. But really it is less than that because we did not have a vaccine against COVID until the spring of 2021, and the COVID IFR was calculated from the spring of 2020 before any vaccine was available, whereas about 2/3 of persons over age 65, among whom nearly all COVID and flu deaths occur, receive the flu vaccine, reference 8. And receiving the flu vaccine reduces risk of intensive care unit ICU admittance by 80%, Thompson et al., reference 9. If 2/3 of the elderly receive the flu vaccine, and among that group it cuts flu deaths by 80%, overall then the flu vaccine cuts flu deaths by a bit more than half. So you could cut that ratio of IFR in half and say unvaccinated COVID is not 3.4-fold, but rather 1.7-fold more lethal than unvaccinated influenza. This fits with the fact that COVID deaths in 2020 relative to the population were about twice the ordinary year's influenza deaths from 1950 to 1970 before widespread use of flu vaccines, as is discussed below. COVID-19 produced 6 times as many influenza pneumonia deaths as an ordinary year in 2020. Going into that, the 6-fold increase in deaths is both greater lethality or likelihood of dying if you are infected than the flu, and greater contagiousness or greater likelihood of being infected than with the flu. We determined the lethality of COVID is 3.4-fold higher than influenza. Contagiousness, therefore, must be 1.8-fold higher than the flu. And going into the 3.4-fold greater lethality is both inherent lethality of COVID and flu, and the fact that flu's lethality is cut by use of the flu vaccine. So the overall equation is 6 times greater deaths than flu equals 1.7-fold greater lethality than unvaccinated flu, times 2-fold cut in deaths by the flu vaccine, times 1.8-fold more contagious. 1918 flu and other flu seasons. How does COVID compare to the 1918 to 1919 Spanish flu and other flu seasons of the past? Here is a table of deaths in the US per million population calculated from CDC statistics. Influenza and pneumonia deaths per capita in the United States have gone down quite a bit just since 1990. In the 1950s and 60s, influenza deaths were usually about 500 per million population, which is half of the current COVID epidemic. COVID is also often compared to the 1918 to 1919 Spanish flu. It should not be. The Spanish flu killed about 6 times as many people relative to the population in 1 year, and 3.5 times as many over the course of the epidemic as COVID killed. And equally importantly, it killed the young at perhaps a higher rate than it killed the old. According to the CDC, the 1918 flu had high mortality in persons under age 5 and ages 20 to 40, as well as those ages 65 and up. Reference 10. Stories on it often say the young died at a higher rate than the old. It should be noted that data is not great on the 1918 flu. The total number dead is an estimate, and while it is clear soldiers and other young people died of the flu at very high rates, the exact age breakdown of deaths is not precisely known. So on top of the 3.5 times greater deaths, the lost life expectancy per death was probably 4 to 8 times greater. Altogether, it should be considered 15 to 30 times worse in terms of lost person years of life per capita than COVID. COVID is much closer in its death toll to ordinary influenza than it is to the 1918 flu. Commentary. You may or may not find these numbers to be a high risk of COVID death for yourself or others. If you are under age 50, you certainly should not for yourself. Children are at a far lower risk of dying from COVID than of ordinary influenza and are at less than 0.001% chance of dying from COVID. Adults younger than 50 are at about the same risk of dying from COVID as from ordinary influenza and had less than a 0.04% chance of dying from COVID in 2020. Likely you find all of those numbers to be lower than you thought they were, but the experts knew from the very beginning of this outbreak, before it had really reached the US, that the infection fatality rate was certainly less than 1% and probably less than 0.5%. That was not well conveyed to the public and has still not been well conveyed to the public. I am pretty sure you have never seen a story in the media that said children are at much less risk of dying from COVID than they are from the flu, or that young and early middle-aged adults are at about the same risk of dying from COVID as from dying from ordinary influenza. Although the infection fatality rate of 9% for persons 85 and older is 3 to 4 times that of influenza, most people are probably under the impression that infection with COVID is almost a death sentence for the elderly, and that at least 1/3 of the 85 and overs who are infected die. Even I thought that would be the result when I did these calculations. That is not correct. Only about 9% of those age 85 and over do. COVID deaths in 2020 are about 6 times higher than ordinary influenza deaths in a year. Some might think that is high, and the media, health officials, and most politicians seem to think it is self-evident that if you have 6x the normal number of flu deaths, you must shut down schools and businesses, even at the cost of causing 16% unemployment, causing tens of thousands of suicides, and throwing 19% of the population into clinical depression. It is not self-evident to me. The way I think about it is, how worried were you on January 1, 2020 that you would die of the flu this year? Multiply that number by 6, and that is how worried you should have been of dying from COVID. For me, I had zero worry I would die from the flu in 2019 or 2020. 6 times 0 is still 0. And COVID is less than twice as lethal in terms of infection fatality rate as ordinary influenza, if you have not been vaccinated against either disease. If you chose not to get the flu vaccine in 2020 or any recent year, and then you became infected with COVID, at that point you should be not quite twice as worried about dying from it as you would have been about dying from the flu if you had been infected with the flu. Your fear of COVID should be less than 2x your fear of flu death, which was probably 0 if you chose not to get a flu vaccine. Again, 2 times 0 is 0. While COVID has produced 6 times the number of recent influenza deaths in a year, it is only twice the number in an ordinary year as recently as the 1960s, before we had widespread use of the flu vaccine. We did not think in the 1960s that our biggest problem was influenza deaths. These numbers have not been well conveyed to the public. The key question for the public is, what is my chance of dying if I am infected? Shortly followed by, what is my child's chance? And what is the chance of the elderly in our society? That is what we needed to know and be told in order to make our own informed decisions about how seriously to take this, and what precautions to take, and what precautions it makes sense for society as a whole to take. The CDC and state health officials, the media, and politicians have never informed us of that. They acted as if the infection fatality rate was the number of deaths divided by the number of verifiable symptomatic infections. But most infected people never bother to get tested because most infected people have mild symptoms, and we had a shortage of tests until recently. So that greatly overstated the lethality of the virus, giving numbers like 7% when the actual infection fatality rate is 0.46%. They have also allowed a misunderstanding to persist that everyone is at high risk of dying from this disease, when the reality is that anyone under age 50 is at very low risk of dying, even if they are infected, and is at the same, or for children, much less risk of dying as they are from ordinary influenza. Even for people 85 and over, they are at about a 9% risk of dying if infected, or a 91% chance of surviving COVID if infected, which I do not think is so terrible considering they are at a 15% chance of dying from all causes and an 85% chance of surviving one more year. And of course, like all of us, they are ultimately at a 100% chance of dying, period. 1.7-fold. COVID-19 is 1.7-fold more lethal than ordinary influenza, meaning if infected with the COVID virus, you are 1.7 times more likely to die from it than you would be if you contracted the flu, if you have not had the vaccine for either virus. Not 10-fold, not 20-fold, not even 6-fold, 1.7-fold. Did you ever hear that from the media or from the CDC? Perhaps you don't believe me, but not 10-fold, not 20-fold. Hello? Not 10-fold. Not tenfold, not 20-fold. Brother, come on. Vaccine for either virus. Not tenfold, not 20-fold, not even 6-fold. 1.7-fold. Did you ever hear that from the media or from the CDC? Perhaps you don't believe me, but the number of COVID deaths is constantly publicized, and it was 6-fold higher in 2020 than the typical number of flu deaths. We are also told COVID is much more contagious than the flu. Deaths are a function of both how likely you are to be infected and how likely you are to die if infected. So if COVID is more contagious than the flu, which it is, that means you are more likely to be infected, and that means the likelihood of dying once infected must be less than 6-fold higher. And certainly no one would deny that the flu vaccine cuts flu deaths. It is simple math. The 6-fold number includes the product of how much more lethal COVID is than the flu, 1.7-fold, times how much more contagious it is, 1.8-fold, times how much the flu vaccine cuts flu deaths, 2-fold. I feel the CDC and health officials, the media and politicians have failed us. They should not have allowed these misunderstandings to persist. They should have tried to calm us, not to make us more afraid. In fact, I would express it more strongly than that. With all the fear of COVID, the primary responsibility of the CDC and the media should have been to tell us what the infection fatality rate of COVID is. That is, your chance of dying if you are infected, and how that varies by age and health condition. It is ridiculous that I have to calculate those numbers here because the CDC never did. Appendix 1. I calculated the numbers in Table 1 from the information in the table below. Number of COVID fatalities was from reference 2, with numbers up to December 12, 2020. Percent of COVID fatalities is the number in each age group as a percentage of the 276,061 total COVID fatalities. Population in each age group is from statistica.com. The COVID infection percentage is the percentage of each age group infected from the data of Anand et al., reference 1, as of early July 2020. The COVID infection fatality rate is calculated as percentage of COVID deaths divided by percentage of the population times the average infection percentage of 9.3 divided by the infection percentage of the given age group times 0.46%, where 0.46% is the overall COVID infection fatality rate that I have calculated from Anand et al. The 0.46% infection fatality rate was calculated from number of deaths of July 15th, as of July 15th, 2020, divided by number infected, which was calculated from 9.3% overall seropositivity as of early July, times 328 million population of the U.S. The overall infection fatality rate for each age group is from reference 6. Appendix 2. Others have found that antibody tests underestimate seroprevalence, and confirming that from reference 6. Appendix 2. Others have found that antibody tests underestimate seroprevalence, and confirming that, one article that reported conducting seroprevalence surveys in various jurisdictions in the United States on 3 occasions found that in most places the seroprevalence went down over time by Jima et al. That can only happen if antibody titers are decreasing over time so that a person tests positive at one point and negative later, even though they have been infected. Burgess et al. If that is the case, it means many people who are infected are not raising IgG antibodies, or their IgG antibody levels fade over time. Also, it was reported that many people with mild infections test negative by the IgG antibody test, but are raising T cells against COVID. That confirms much other evidence that a T cell response is more effective in controlling COVID than an antibody response. Immune response broadly comes in 2 types, cellular, meaning T cells, or humoral, meaning antibodies. T cells are the cells depleted in AIDS. We know that T cells in a cellular immune response are generally more effective in controlling viral infections than an antibody response, and evidence suggests that is true also of controlling COVID. So the people who mount the best immune response to COVID and therefore have mild or no symptoms are those who produce T cells and not antibodies, and they are therefore likely to test negative for prior infection with SARS-CoV-2 by antibody tests, even though they have been infected and even though they have long-lasting immunity.